Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Muthingini AA Wash Process Kenya from Kurasu Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kurasu, based out of Kyoto, Japan, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including last year when we visited one of their coffee shops out in Kyoto. They're also another Japanese-based coffee roaster that will eventually be featured in our Asian coffee roaster tier list. So I do want to review a few more of their coffees to determine where we wanted to place them on that list. I was fortunate enough to find this bag of coffee at Revolver, which is a multi-roaster up in Vancouver, and they do carry Kurasu pretty regularly for anybody else that's interested in trying them. But for now, we will see how this Kenya turned out, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So Kurasu does have this one listed as being light relative to their offerings, but I think I've said in the past that Japan isn't necessarily the lightest roasting country when it comes to coffees in general. So while this one is light by their standards, and it is still lighter than the majority of Japanese-based coffee roasters that we do review, I feel like a lot of people wouldn't necessarily align this one with being a particularly light coffee. I would say it's a little bit more on that medium light side, as it's not necessarily overly light, but even then it is still, I would say, notably lighter than the majority of either Japanese or a lot of American-based coffee roasters as well. Kind of falls into that middle range for that category. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 19, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup was offering an abundance of Kenyan characteristics, mostly in terms of the brightness, as there was also a fair bit of savoriness to the cup as well. So vintage, classic Kenyan coffee in so many regards. Most defining factor was a little bit more bitterness than the average Kenyan coffee, as it was reminiscent of the previous experiences we've had with Japanese roasted Kenyan coffees in general. So it was a decent start, pretty much the epitome of what I was expecting from this coffee, going into it with a slight bit more bitterness. Day 22 through the Chemex, and a pretty similar second impression, as these slightly bitter qualities continue to kind of accentuate some of the more Kenyan characteristics to this one. A slight but better sweetness also feels present within this one, as it feels like it's opening up a little bit more, but these first two impressions have been just about as straightforward as I might have expected for this coffee. Day 25 through the April brewer, and the cup is notably more savory with a strong abundance of the Kenyan-like characteristics of that infamous T word. In addition to that, there's plenty of the tart berries and herbality, with the secondary characteristics being that stronger savory note once again. Day 28 through the V60 with Kurasu's recipe, and the cup is the best it's been up to this point, with classic Kenyan tart berry base and more notable depth to it with a better sweetness and a little bit of the listed peach attributes to this one. I was always a little bit kind of skeptical that there would be any of the peachiness in this one. That's something we'll discuss a little bit more throughout this review, but as of this moment, it's the first time I've experienced it. In addition to that, there's notably less savoriness and a slight bit more of an herbal florality and bitterness to it. So I would say it's better overall, as it seemed to accentuate some more of the qualities I was hoping for, while toning down some of the ones that I wasn't necessarily enjoying. Day 31 through the Chemex with Kurasu's recipe, and this was probably one of my least favorite experiences of this coffee up to this point, as it was toned down relative to the previous day, as it had notably less intensity to the red berry tones, offering more subtlety in the herbal floral sense. There's still a slight bit of the citric bitterness, but even that was a little bit more toned down relative to some of the earlier experiences. So I said this is maybe a little bit under extracted in general, not necessarily my favorite, just an okay day. Day 34 through the B60 with our standard recipe, and the cup is relatively better than some of the earlier experiences, as it continues to open up ever so slightly. I'm really starting to feel a lot more intensity to this coffee, especially in the direction that I was looking for within it, while simultaneously, interestingly, a lot of the more strong savory Kenyan attributes have been toned down naturally, which is quite nice. It's still present, as well as the herbal floral tones, and in addition to that, more of that citric attribute, but it continues to remain, we'll say at this time, mostly tart berry forward, which is very much what you'd expect for this coffee. And when it comes to Kenyan coffees, I'm definitely hoping for more of those in a sweeter candied sense, and significantly less of the savory aspects. Day 37 through the Chemex, and this was the best of coffee I'd been to this point, and I couldn't necessarily tell if all of this time has finally done it justice or if it's been the kind of tinkering and adjustments back and forth, because this was much more in line with the listed brown sugar sweetness. So I was skeptical that we were going to experience that, especially given some of the earlier experiences. But the cup was just notably sweeter in general, with a much more prominent candied sense and significantly less of the savory aspects to it. Much better refined berries too, and a little bit more of a candied sense as well. So this one was by far my most enjoyable day up to this point. And on day 40, we opted to go back to the Chemex, and it continues to offer that better experience. So I definitely settled on this being the best I've enjoyed this coffee, as it has plenty of the anticipated Kenyan bright berries, the herbal florality, and that complementary citric quality, which in addition to that has seemed to slightly dissipate in terms of that overall bitterness. I think there's a grapefruit note listed on here. I could have that wrong, but that's kind of the best way I aligned this coffee right from the onset. Candied sweetness in line with the listed brown sugar, and a slight bitterness to that citrus as well, but once again a little bit more toned down relative to some of the earlier experiences we'd had. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through them, and we will start with the finish at a level 4. And we'll just discuss that alongside the acidity, because I always say every single time we review a washed Kenyan, something went horribly wrong if either of those don't score minimum level 4 in terms of the coffee, and both of those are present, definitely in that lingering both floral herbal sense, that hibiscus-like attribute, and in terms of that tart berry component. But this one had a little bit more of a candy finish to it, so I enjoyed that part in the finish. And then of course the brightness was an ever-present quality, definitely also on par with that expected tart berry, that current that they have listed. So a lot of that makes sense. A lot of it's pretty straightforward. We'll actually move on to the florality level 4. I briefly mentioned that sort of rose hip, that hibiscus-like component, that red florality that seems to be an ever-present component in so many washed Kenyan coffees, definitely present within this one, and one of the more prominent characteristics throughout. Berry fruit level 4, and once again, same thing, tart berries in notable abundance, and I don't think that there's too much worth saying on that one. It was an ever-present quality as well. Citrus fruit level 4, one of the earlier experiences I'd had of this coffee did seem to be a little bit more citric forward, also in a little bit more bitter of a sense. I said that it reminds me a little bit more of a grapefruit, if anything. So those two things, definitely pretty straightforward, not too much time necessarily worth discussing on those. But then the sweetness level 4, that's one of the most important things that I wanted to discuss in this coffee, because a lot of the times when it comes to Kenyan coffees, it's a little bit more tricky to justify that, especially if they are just skewing so much more in that tart berry sense. This one definitely had a very nice candied feel to it throughout the entirety of this coffee, and it was very helpful that they did have a brown sugar note list on here, because I said I can definitely see where that's coming from with this one. Earlier experiences didn't necessarily yield the most amount of sweetness, but as this coffee did progress just naturally, it definitely opened up, and by the end I'm like, this is definitely a true level 4, especially relative to Kenyan coffees. Then we have a handful of level 3s. We will start on the other side of the tasting wheel with the stone fruit level 3. Towards the end, a little bit more of that peachiness. I could see it. It's a little bit more, I would say, peach brightness as opposed to just like a truly defined peachiness. But even then, it does come also in a slightly sweeter sense too, so you can experience that in a number of different manners. In addition to that, the caramel at the level 3, and that's the candied sweetness to this one. And it's kind of interesting with a lot of Japanese coffee roasters. I do oftentimes find them to be a little bit more candied than I would say the modern day American coffee roasters, which don't always seem to prioritize the sweetness to their coffees. So it's always helpful to me when we are reviewing a Japanese coffee to kind of remind ourselves that a lot of their coffees do have this sort of attribute to them. And then the savoriness level 3. I think at the end of the day, I was wondering whether or not this one would actually achieve that level 3 mark. And since it did have a little bit more of that classic Kenyan savoriness to it, especially on some of the earlier days, I said, I think I still need to keep it at a level 3. Maybe it's on the lower side of level 3 relative to some of the ones we've scored a level 3 before. It's lower than those, but it's definitely not necessarily something that's you can kind of overlook within this one. Body, level 3, plenty of that juicy Kenyan body fully expected within this coffee, and even with the adjustments on brew method we had made, it still had plenty of body and texture to it as well, as expected with it. And then the final thing worth discussing, and the most important thing, is the cleanliness level 3. And I really gave it a long and hard consideration as to whether or not we could bump it up to level 4. But as I've always said, if there's a little bit too much of that Kenyan-like savoriness, I'll just kind of say it, that of course being that tomato-like attribute, then it'll always ever so slightly hinder the coffee. I should also note that maybe a lot of the reason the savoriness is at that level 3, and I'm kind of thinking about it, yeah, there's a little bit of a tea-like aspect to this one as well. So it's not just all that tomato-like component, but even then it is still present enough to hinder the overall clarity to it. Though still on the higher side of level 3, you could justify level 4. I'd be fine with it if it was there, but I really wanted to demonstrate that part in this tasting wheel. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one grew on me a lot ever since that first impression. The first time I brewed it, I said, oh no, we're going to be working with a very tomato-forward Kenyan that I'm not going to be enjoying. But I was very pleased to see the way that this coffee did progress, kind of skewing from that notably more savory experience with a little bit more bitterness than I would enjoy to something that was a lot more candied forward, a lot sweeter, and better presented notes as well. So credits to Kurasu on this one. I think it's a very nice coffee. I think it's also kind of tricky to gauge this coffee roaster based off the coffees that we have reviewed, because most of them have been on the, we'll just say, they're washed or the pulp natural Brazilian coffee. So I think I do kind of need to get an idea of maybe some of their non-washed offerings as well. And even then, a lot of what we've reviewed, I would say, has been better than average for what they are relative to the coffees in comparison to them. So that's why I really do want to review maybe a couple more of their coffees to kind of get a better idea. But this one was really nice, and I do think it's a pretty well presented coffee in general. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It is a very Kenyan coffee, so I think it needs to be kind of recommended towards Kenyan coffee drinkers in general. It has plenty of that brightness, and especially in terms of that red berry sense, plenty of the body, plenty of the lingering finish. It just has plenty of everything that you'd expect from a Kenyan coffee, that florality, that herbal-like aspect to it, but it's also presented in a sweeter sense as well, while not necessarily sacrificing any of the other things that typically come with Kenyan coffees. I think maybe what seems to set this one apart is that it has a slightly more, we'll say, active bitterness relative to some of the other citric qualities within the coffee, which does give it a little bit of uniqueness in general. And I think even then, the slightly higher than average sugary sweetness to this one also sets it apart from other Kenyan coffees. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Muthingini AA Wash Process Kenya from Kurasu Coffee. Thank you for watching.